These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? What makes a painting a masterpiece? That is, of course, a subjective judgment, but there are some paintings so important, so iconic, that they come to represent an age or a culture or a nation. And it's these kind of pictures which very often form the centerpiece of the great museums and galleries of the world. All around the globe, there are images which speak to a nation in ways that no others can match. And here in Amsterdam, there is a canvas loved by the Dutch like no other. This colossal gallery at the heart of the vast and beautiful Rijksmuseum doesn't just contain the most important painting in Dutch history, it was actually built around it. In what feels like a huge secular chapel dedicated to Dutch art, there hangs Rembrandt's world-famous and utterly stupendous Night Watch. This was an act of risk-taking, almost of arrogance, created by the greatest Dutch artist at the very height of his powers. Now, it's nothing short of a national treasure. So what is it? It's a group portrait of a militia company, what you might call a platoon of Amsterdam's People's Army. There are 16 men visible in all. We know most of their names. Right at the center with that magnificent white ruff is Frans Banning Kock, the commander of the militia, giving the order to advance. And beside him in the canary yellow is Willem van Ruttenberg, his lieutenant. All around the picture, there are different things going on. There's a dog barking, there's a young girl staring into the distance, there's a man cleaning his musket. Somebody else right in the center has fired his musket by mistake and nearly hit in somebody else's hat. Rembrandt's characters feel so alive, they could almost jump off the canvas. But if they did, they wouldn't get very far. Now, if you've been watching really carefully, you may have noticed there is a strange big glass box around it. Now, why is that? And the answer is, it is being restored, properly for the first time in more than 40 years. For your average masterpiece, any major restoration would be carried out as far away from the prying eyes of the public as possible. But the Night Watch isn't average, it's not allowed to skulk or to take time out. People care about this picture so much that they're prepared to watch it being restored. If they're not prepared literally to watch paint dry, then they're prepared to watch varnish dry, which you must admit is kind of unusual. So what is it about this collection of rather chaotic, strutting, striding, would-be unprofessional soldiers from another age in their impressive collection of strange hats and weird party clothes that gets so many people so emotional, so committed? It's a mystery that spans more than 300 years, takes in an artist's triumphant rise and tragic fall, and almost sees the Night Watch forgotten forever. This painting's story begins in a period of unrivaled creativity in Dutch art, made by new money and cutthroat competition.
The Netherlands in the 17th century was a very, very particular environment because it had this growing, flourishing art market.
You could buy a painting just for your weekly wage. And paintings were sold at markets, you know, alongside kitchenware, chickens. So these weren't just objects for the extremely wealthy, but anyone could own works of art.
This was a world of unequaled artistic production. Make it new, make it fast, make it different, with groundbreaking changes in technique, perspective and subject. Born in July 1606, Rembrandt had arrived into the Dutch Golden Age.
Rembrandt was born in the Dutch town of Leiden, which is about half an hour away from Amsterdam. And he was born in a pretty kind of bourgeois family.
His father was a miller, big family, lots of children. They managed to afford to send him to the local Latin school, so he learnt languages, he learnt about religion.
But there was really only one thing that interested the young Rembrandt. His itch, his instinct, his determination was to be an artist. And at 14, he began his apprenticeship.
He entered the workshop of a local artist, and that's where he learned, as it were, the craft.
He would have learned how to draw, how to use colour, how to mix and make his own paints. It doesn't appear that he just wakes up and is suddenly a brilliant artist, but rather, in his early works, with our own eyes, we can see him progressing.
Rembrandt's first canvases are full of mistakes, but each and every one ripples with ambition. They show daring colours, bold textures, and above all, an unusual approach to lighting. He was a young artist who wanted urgently to be different, to produce a style that was his alone. This was the formative period for the young Rembrandt, and much of the thinking and the skill you can see in the Night Watch goes back to the Leiden years, when he was working on the consistency of his paint and finding new ways to portray light in a more dynamic fashion.
His early masterpiece from that period, Judas Returning the 30 Pieces of Silver, is spectacular because it is all about creating the drama of the scene and emphasizing the drama through very dramatic lighting. Also, when you look at his very early self-portraits, there is one where almost his entire face is in shadow.
It was this painting, created when Rembrandt was in his early 20s, that put him on the map. No one had painted themselves in quite the same way before. This was one of the first of more than 80 self-portraits Rembrandt would create across his lifetime. And it brought the young painter to the attention of some of the most influential art brokers in the area. But soon, even his hometown wasn't big enough to contain Rembrandt's ambition. What this single-minded artist had wanted from birth was to stand out, and for that, he'd have to try himself on a far bigger stage.
There's so much opportunity in Amsterdam. Those most prestigious commissions, those were to be found in the big city.
If you really wanted to get big-time clients, then you had to go to Amsterdam. That's where the riches really were.
Rembrandt moved to a studio in Amsterdam in 1631. To put it simply, this aspiring young painter was following the money. During the Golden Age, Amsterdam was already overflowing with talented artists competing for fame and fortune. Joining them, Rembrandt was making a supremely bold move that would put him step by steady step on the road to the Night Watch. The Night Watch is one of the most famous paintings in the world, the jewel in the crown of Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. And it's easy to see why. This is a canvas bursting with life, brimming with stories and hints of intrigue, one of which is the identity of a half-hidden face only just emerging from the shadows.
Now, of the 34 different people in the picture, there is one who technically shouldn't be there at all. He's absolutely dead center, right up towards the top. A very, very distinctive snub nose, a little round, inquiring, slightly cheeky eye. It is, of course, Rembrandt himself. Like Alfred Hitchcock, he's put himself into the film, as it were.
The Night Watch shows a glimpse of an artist at the exhilarating peak of his power and ambition. Just over 10 years earlier, he'd arrived in Amsterdam, desperate to make his fortune.
Amsterdam would have been very exciting in the 17th century. It's loud, it's busy, it was a real metropolis. And for artists, that represented a huge opportunity.
War with the Spanish Empire was over, Dutch ships crisscrossed the world, and now the city was packed with wealthy merchants, eager to spend their fortunes on portraits for their brand new townhouses. Fresh in from Leiden, which itself had been besieged by the Spanish, here was a painter who could offer something new.
Rembrandt kind of burst onto the scene and quite quickly got quite important commissions.
He was one of the first artists to capture physical expressions across a face. He painted portraits as though he could penetrate the person and get their personality.
He uses highlights so cleverly that you see that wet bit at the bottom of the eyelid, and the wrinkles around the eyes and so forth are so acutely observed.
These are very impactful pieces. He breathes life into his sitters, and other artists are just not at that same level at that time.
From his very first commission, it was clear that Rembrandt's work was different to everything else around him. He painted faces bathed in light and shadow, used the wrong end of his brush to scratch individual hairs into the paint, and became a master of touchably real surfaces. But most important, with a skill that would become vital to the success of the Night Watch, he depicted his sitters with a fresh immediacy.
There is a kind of ruddy, earthy realism about the faces. These are actual, living, breathing, sweating people that you could have met in the streets of Amsterdam, and there is no mistaking that at all.
Suddenly, this provincial miller's boy was the most popular portraitist in the city. And yet, always hungry for the next advance, Rembrandt needed more. Private commissions were fine, but he really wanted to create work on a bigger scale. He wanted to be properly noticed.
I think his first major success was the anatomy lesson of Nicholas Tulp. That was painted in 1632, and that was a very public commission. It was a way of marketing himself. And I think people would have seen that and thought, yes, that's the man who I want to paint my portrait too.
Rembrandt's first multi-portrait painting was a taste of the Night Watch to come, and it reveals his swelling ego. For the first time, he simply signed himself Rembrandt, audaciously assuming the same one-name celebrity label as Leonardo, Michelangelo, or Raphael. He saw himself as the rising hero of the Amsterdam art scene. What Rembrandt wanted now was a lifestyle to match. In 1634, he married the love of his life, Saskia van Uylenburg, and the glamorous young couple threw themselves into enjoying Rembrandt's good fortune.
They enjoyed life. They went out, they spent, they lived a very lavish lifestyle.
Rembrandt was very confident. He was spending lots of money. He was quite flash. He was very pleased that he was earning this money and saw that this was not going to end, so he could just spend it as it came.
He was living the high life.
Fancy clothes, luxurious meals. Rembrandt, it seemed, could shell out for anything his heart desired, including this princely three-story townhouse in the most sought-after area of the city. Now a popular Amsterdam museum, Dr. Lidewij de Koekkoek is its director.
Rembrandt bought this house in 1639, and by that time he was the most famous artist in Amsterdam, and he was very wealthy. It cost 13,000 guilders, which was a fortune in that time. And this was the most opulent and large house in the whole street.
Rembrandt's spending, however, didn't stop here. Every time he finished painting, he'd pick up his wallet and head out shopping, filling his new house with curious purchases.
This room is Rembrandt's art cabinet, Kunstkabinett in Dutch. And this is where he shows his ambition, he shows his extreme drive and his fascination for beautiful objects.
He was something of a spenderholic, and his tastes were quite eclectic. So he buys things like armor,
Venetian glass, seashells,
stuffed animals, and bits of coral.
We don't know how much he spent. It must have been a fortune.
And in his new mansion, there was one room that was more important than any other.
Now, this was, of course, the largest room in the house. This is the grand studio. The light is fantastic. It's northern light, and it would have reflected beautifully into the studio. And of course, light, dark and light, chiaroscuro, very important in Rembrandt's work.
The high creativity of the master painter needed to be matched with the basic haggling business of funding his lifestyle. To sell himself and win the big commissions, Rembrandt needed to look the part.
This is the grand entrance hall. We call it the voorhuis, the front house. It would have been the grand entrance next to the street. And these were sort of the public areas where visitors were allowed in and where Rembrandt showed the opulence of his household, but also his success as a painter. And it would have been really set to impress. It would have helped close deals on paintings.
It's most likely to have been here that in 1640, after almost a decade working in Amsterdam, Rembrandt was approached for his biggest commission yet, the Night Watch.
So the Night Watch was commissioned by the Kloveniersdolen, which was the headquarter of the civic militia, and they commissioned it for their Great Hall.
The civic militia were close-knit groups of citizen soldiers, a kind of dad's army standing by to protect their communities from Spanish attack. And the way their portraits were captured was a tradition unique to the 17th century. For years, they'd been painted by the most established artists of the day in a similar style, the men dressed up in their finest clothes, arranged in a simple line like a school photo or a bizarre bus queue. But in 1640, when the group from District 2 decided to commission their portrait, rather than go with a reliable regular, they turned to Amsterdam's edgy celebrity, even though Rembrandt had never tackled anything like this before. Carla Ohers is an expert in art history.
They were vain men. They wanted the portraits to be done by a famous portrait painter. Rembrandt in those days was really like a superstar. So they were commissioning their group portrait with him because they wanted to have their portrait done by a famous artist.
The company leader, brash enough to put his portrait into the hands of the radical young Rembrandt, was pink-faced, red-haired Captain Frans Banning Kock.
It's a name I think every Dutch person knows because he is the main character in the Night Watch, the head of the civic militia group. He was in charge.
As tradition decreed, Banning Kock would have wanted his expensive commission to capture his men as war heroes, even if the reality was somewhat different.
Originally, they were defending the city in times of war. So in that period, the war against Spain. But when Rembrandt was doing the Night Watch, the Spanish troops were gone. My opinion, they were not real soldiers anymore. There was a sense of nostalgia. The Dutch people were very respectful towards them and grateful towards them for what they had done in the past. But what was there left for them to do? They were, in general, rich, important people. We know about them as Old Boys Network, a sort of Rotary Club or Lions Club. They were quite well known because of their, well,
gatherings in which they were drinking and eating and maybe gambling and giving each other good positions within the society.
They may have done more networking and drinking than fighting, but the importance of the militia was still deeply ingrained in their communities and their minds. This was a young country which had just freed itself from the Spanish Empire by fighting. But Rembrandt couldn't bring himself to copy what had come before him, even if radical reinvention would add extra difficulty to an already tricky brief.
You have to paint anywhere between 10 and 20 guys, but that makes for a really boring composition if you have to just to line them up. So the challenge for the artist really was to turn this into an interesting composition where you have the impression that they maybe interact with each other, that they talk to each other, but they also all have to look at the viewer in order to be recognized. So it seems like an almost impossible task.
This was why most artists responded with a traditional, simple arrangement. Even then, there were added complications.
They paid for their individual portraits, so the more money you were paying, the best position you could get.
The cheapest option would be at the sides of the painting, in profile, maybe just your head or a bit of your eye. And the most expensive would be your whole figure, doing something majestic, doing something very dramatic.
With the Night Watch, Rembrandt was juggling 18 different figures and egos, and the position of his subjects wasn't his only challenge, because this work was not intended to stand alone. 6 other Dutch artists had also been commissioned to make major group portraits for the same room, and by the time Rembrandt started painting, 4 had already been finished.
They had all played by the rules. This was entirely competent bus-cue painting, and therefore, for the ever-ambitious Rembrandt, more than a little boring.
And so the artist who'd based his entire career on being different decided to create an entirely new type of militia portrait. When it was finally unveiled, the Night Watch would indeed be a painting completely unlike any of its predecessors. In 1640, Rembrandt began work on a painting that would come to define him, the Night Watch. This was the only civic militia portrait he would ever produce, but true to form, Rembrandt scrapped convention, instead taking the biggest risk of his career.
What Rembrandt did, which was very different, was to place his figures as if they're in an actual battle. It actually looks like they're about to go to war. And he constructs a narrative around them. He presents what is a portrait more like a history painting. That had never been done before and was completely game-changing.
This was amazing. This was like watching a movie, and because the figures are life-size, you really feel as though you've got to get out the way because they're going to come towards you and you're in danger. You're in the way.
He has created a very unusual and risky composition, throwing aside all the usual rules about lining people up so that he can achieve the illusion of this militia company literally marching out of the wall, off the canvas and towards the viewer. And to do that, he has made some very strange decisions about the lighting.
Most other artists lit their civic guard portraits pretty simply, a bright overhead glare. But now Rembrandt tried something very different. Shadows shroud much of the canvas, and instead he picked out his main characters almost as if with spotlights. If you look just here, for example, you can see the light illuminating Koch's outstretched hand, casting a shadow which cuts across the Amsterdam coat of arms embroidered on his lieutenant's jacket.
It's a bit like a theatre director or a film director's lighting, and that gives the picture a dynamism that Rembrandt can't have been sure when he started it would actually achieve.
The whole painting is a performance, and Rembrandt has even provided his own soundtrack. A musket goes off behind the captain. There's the rat-a-tat-tat of a drum. A dog seems to bark. It's a cacophony of noise, action, and movement.
And here is the final, almost ludicrous risk that Rembrandt is taking with this picture. This is a militia. These are would-be soldiers. They are men who want to be remembered as soldiers, dangerous men, except that this must be the least dangerous, least lethal, least threatening group of so-called would-be soldiers in the history of art. They are ridiculous. One's firing his gun by mistake, all their weapons are pointing in different directions, and their mascot girl is laughing at them. Rembrandt is telling a story, but it's not the story that militia expect. It is an entirely different story.
And it was one he had to tell carefully in order to tread a fine line between honour and insult. This was a far from straightforward painting to complete, and for nearly 2 years Rembrandt worked on the canvas relentlessly. In July 1642, the Night Watch was finally finished, and with great expectation installed in the militia group's Guild Hall. I think it's fair to say they were in for a surprise.
It wasn't what they expected at all. You know, they didn't know how to react to this drama. Are they meant to laugh at it? Are they meant to be aghast at it? Are they meant to be in awe of the fact that every one of those people is captured through the expression and the personality and the stance?
I think some of the sitters in the picture were quite unhappy about how they were shown because they did not get the prominence that they had expected.
But it must have been admired because it was immediately put on the wall. Rembrandt was paid for it in full, and the head of the Civic Guard had several copies made for himself to have in his own home and to give to friends.
The Night Watch may have been unveiled to a mixed reception, but no one could deny that this was daring, unique, bold. Rembrandt had taken a huge gamble, and he'd created something extraordinary. Everyone could see that. But now, just as Rembrandt triumphed artistically, disaster befell him at home as his beloved Saskia died.
Rembrandt really loved his wife Saskia. That was a period of great melancholy for Rembrandt. He was devastated when she died.
Commercial success seemed to mean so much less without Saskia to share it. A year before, she'd given birth to the couple's only surviving child, a boy they'd named Titus. And now Rembrandt faced raising his son alone. But his time of disaster wasn't over.
After the Night Watch, which really represents the peak of his career, Rembrandt's career goes into something of a decline. In the decade that follows, his commissions significantly decrease.
Public taste changed. People wanted a little less brown, something more fashionable, something more frivolous, what they considered to be lighter, brighter paintings.
And I think Rembrandt couldn't or didn't want to keep up.
For the first time in his working life, Rembrandt was out of fashion, out of commissions, and therefore, pretty soon, out of money.
Rembrandt continued to spend extravagantly even after his fortunes were in decline. And eventually, in 1652, his creditors said, "That's enough, we're calling in our debts." And Rembrandt couldn't cope. Eventually, he had to sell his house and possessions at auction and was forced into bankruptcy.
Rembrandt had to move from the big house he'd bought with Saskia in Amsterdam to a very rough part of town where he lived for the last 13 years of his life.
The man who'd once been Amsterdam's richest painter now cowered in the city's shadiest suburb. It had only been a handful of years since he'd produced his masterpiece, but his life was now unrecognisable.
It was a real fall from grace. In order to recover some of his debts, he's even forced to sell Saskia's tomb in 1664.
That must have caused him great melancholy and trauma. She was the love of his life.
Rembrandt's livelihood was hanging by a thread, and yet, wrinkle by wrinkle, failure by failure, he magicked disaster into triumph, The realism he'd brought to Banningcock's men now applied to his own ageing features, creating what are now seen as his most moving work. Even now, worse was still to come. In 1668, Titus, his son, was killed by a plague. There was simply nothing left for Rembrandt. He struggled on for one more year before dying penniless and alone at the age of 63. He was so forgotten by the town that had once loved him, there wasn't even an official notice of his death.
In spite of the fame Rembrandt achieved in his lifetime, he was buried in a pauper's grave. So it's an unmarked grave, and it doesn't exist today. You can't find it.
All that remains of his final resting place is a plaque, erected in 1909 in the Westerkirk Church, acknowledging his forlorn death.
It's frankly very moving to be here, to reflect on Rembrandt's own life, all the hard work, the years and years of toil, the terrible disappointments, the struggles, the disasters, the bankruptcies, and towards the end of his life, that sense of a great dark cloud hanging over everything. What would he have thought had he been able to be here now and realised that his greatest and most complicated work is at the heart of Amsterdam, at the heart of the greatest Dutch museum, and in many ways at the heart of the Dutch people?
But before the Night Watch could embark on its triumphant progress to Dutch national icon, it would, a little like its creator, suffer its own humiliation. 73 years after it was first hung in the militia HQ, the colossal canvas was moved to Amsterdam's palatial town hall, now a palace. Alice Tachken is its curator of exhibitions.
So this is the room where the Night Watch was hung in 1715, when it was taken from the Kloveniersstoelen to here. This was the office of the colonels of the Great War Council.
But in bringing the Night Watch to its new home, the officials faced a rather tricky problem.
The Night Watch was placed in between those two doors behind me. The problem was, though, that the space between the doors was too small. So they took the pragmatic route and cut it down on all sides.
In what must be one of the most brutal truncations in art history, Rembrandt's glorious Night Watch was chopped down to fit its new home.
We know what was lost on the Night Watch because of a small-scale copy made by Gerrit Lundens. The portions that were taken off were actually essential to understand the painting. So what we see on the copy is that the guard company is passing through a city gate and over a bridge over a canal. So that makes it very logical that all the people are moving.
So they cut off about 2 feet from the left, which took off a couple of people, and it cut off an area at the top, which meant that all the wonderful perspective and the archway and the rods and the banners, that was all not as intended.
We have no idea what happened to the pieces that they cut off. They cut those pieces off because they thought they weren't that important. So in all probability, they just threw them out. We have no idea. Maybe they'll turn up sometime.
By the end of the 18th century, Rembrandt was long dead and forgotten. His remains lost in a pauper's grave, his most important work butchered to fit its space in a gloomy council chamber. It seemed this masterpiece must surely be consigned to history, and yet there's an extraordinary twist to the story still to come. By the turn of the 19th century, Rembrandt's Night Watch, the work he'd been most proud of, the one he'd produced right at the peak of his extraordinary career, was hanging in an out-of-the-way council chamber, a fraction of its original size. But this all but forgotten masterpiece had not reached the end of the road just yet.
Now, among many other things, Rembrandt was a storyteller, and I think he would have been delighted that his greatest painting, his most complicated painting, is not only valued around the world for its own qualities, but also for the extraordinary and, frankly, bizarre story behind it.
And the next chapter of this canvas's tale begins 300 miles from Amsterdam in the world's artistic capital at the time, Paris. By the later 19th century, a new artistic movement was gripping the French, the Impressionists, a radical group of then young avant-garde artists painting real life as they saw it. They much preferred Rembrandt's work to the cold academic traditions of their own city. They loved the rich warmth of his shadows, the immediacy and the realism of his sitters. This new wave of painters felt a kinship with the old Dutch master.
There's a real reappreciation of Rembrandt, and I think people like the romantic, wild side of Rembrandt, you know, especially those late works where he's really painting with very thick paint. What was once out of fashion becomes more loved.
Certainly his humanity in the pictures, his talent for getting through the surface to something deeper in the sitter, and his compositions, the lighting and so forth, has certainly impressed and influenced many artists.
Van Gogh called him a magician, writing, "Rembrandt says things for which there are no words in any language." And as his status and influence soared around the world, the Dutch too began to notice. The prodigal son was, at long last, welcomed home.
He was rediscovered, if you like, and then became a national icon as the archetype of Dutchness. He became the national hero.
And as Rembrandt came back in vogue, so too did his most patriotic painting, a reminder of the days when the Dutch had fought an empire to found their citizens' republic. In 1885, Amsterdam's brand new Rijksmuseum prepared to open to the public. The Night Watch was top of the curator's priority list. And they had a much more radical solution than their 18th century counterparts about how to fit this enormous canvas to the wall. They decided to build it a whole new wing of its own.
This gallery was specifically built for the Night Watch. You know, this kind of what resembles a church interior. It's a gallery of honor, and you walk in a ceremonial way up to the high point, which any normal church be the altar. At the end of the enfilade is then the great masterpiece, which is the Night Watch.
Rembrandt's masterpiece was no longer just being displayed, it was being worshipped. Resting in the very heart of the new National Gallery, this painting was now a national treasure.
Rembrandt painted the Night Watch to raise pride in anyone who looks at it, civic pride, to be proud of your town, proud of your country. And centuries later, it still does that. It does exactly that for Amsterdam and for the rest of the Netherlands.
That painting's so loved by the Dutch because it's part of their history and it shows, you know, we're heroes and we're here to protect and we're dashing and we're frivolous and we're action-packed, we're superheroes.
Night Watch mania has gripped the Dutch nation ever since. Nowadays, Rembrandt's canvas is visited by more than 2 million people every single year. It's so loved that when the Rijksmuseum reopened after major refurbishment works in 2013, the painting was welcomed back on display with enormous fanfare.
People go wild. The painting's paraded through the streets of Amsterdam. There's tremendous celebration.
The Night Watch is transported in this huge wooden crate, and there's children there waving flags and people are throwing flowers, and it's almost like the World Cup final footballers have arrived home.
And the extraordinary tributes to this beloved canvas haven't stopped there. To mark the museum's reopening, this group of actors in southern Holland brought the Night Watch to a shopping centre in a way that would surely have made Rembrandt chuckle. It's a love affair that shows no sign of abating.
It tells a story in a way that no other painting has ever done. It tells a fragment of history with action.
It's crazy that a painting in the 21st century is treated with such adoration, but this is such an iconic painting, and Rembrandt is such a symbol of Holland and Amsterdam that it holds a place like no other work can.
A national icon, absolutely. But for me, it's so much more. The Night Watch is a painting about perfectly ordinary people standing up to tyranny. And that's a theme that can speak for everyone.
This is a picture which comes out of the Dutch experience, but it's not for the Dutch, it's for everybody. Because what does it show? It shows a group of very human humans, strutting, ridiculous, absurd. They are silly, as I am silly, as you are silly. But they're coming together for a common purpose. They're all doing their own thing in this picture, but it shows the moment just before they do one single thing, marching out into the light together. This shows what happens when a free people come together for the common good. It is therefore the greatest Republican painting ever made, a great painting of democracy and ultimately of tolerance. It shows what happens at that very moment when we stop doing our own little self-absorbed, selfish things and come together to do one big thing all together. And at that moment, the encroaching dark, which seems so scary, which surrounds them and surrounds every one of us, suddenly doesn't seem quite so frightening after all.
Next time, Tate Britain's most popular and most haunting canvas.
This is not a pretty story. It's a young woman's suicide by drowning.
A painting in which life mirrored art.
The fact that Lizzie Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism.
And that even inspired a grave robbing.
He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin.
The remarkable story of Millet's Ophelia. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe,
there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power.
Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world?
All around the world, there are great galleries and museums crammed with beautiful art, which are open to everybody, free to all of us. Sometimes that's because of an act of national determination. Sometimes it's because of an individual bequest or legacy. When this one, Tate Britain, opened its doors first in 1897, it was the gift to the British of a Liverpool sugar merchant. Sir Henry Tate's great thing was sugar cubes, but his other great thing was British art, and he wanted to share his obsessive love of it with the rest of us.
Tate began this gallery with 65 of his own fine and memorable paintings, and at the heart of that collection there was one particularly special piece.
It's been famous since before the gallery was built, and it's still its most popular picture. The Victorians loved it, and so do we. It is luscious, gorgeous to look at, but this is not a pretty story. It's a young, disturbed woman's suicide by drowning. I'm talking, of course, about John Everett Millet's Ophelia.
You'd need to be a cold fish not to be moved. Simultaneously beautiful and deeply shocking, Ophelia is the crowning achievement of one of the most skilled and ambitious painters of Victorian Britain.
Millet was considered an absolute genius with a paintbrush. He could do almost anything. Flowers fresh, flowers drenched and drowning. Little touches of sunlight on leaves, a face perfectly rendered, wet hair sinking into the water.
Others had painted Ophelia before, but nothing like this. It isn't stagey or really melodramatic. Here is a real woman, briefly suspended in living water, almost ecstatic in her despair. So who was this doomed and dying figure? How was Ophelia captured on canvas, and why does this image still hold such an important place in one of the greatest art collections in the world?
To really understand this image, we have to go back to the very beginnings of its life, because behind the romantic scene lies a much darker and more revolutionary story.
It's a tale of a major artistic rebellion, of ruthless ambition and Victorian macabre. But before all of that, we start decorously in a far more conventional setting, just 2 miles from where Ophelia now hangs, in the place that mattered most to any aspiring Victorian painter, the Royal Academy of Arts. It was here, in December 1840, that an extraordinary young painter was first introduced to the Victorian art scene.
Millet was a child prodigy. He went to art school at a very young age, and he got into the Royal Academy when he was just 11 years of age.
He was the youngest ever person to attend the Royal Academy as a student. Prior to that, the youngest had been Turner, who went at the age of 14, which in itself was quite prodigious.
That's a record the young Millet still holds today. The Royal Academy was the only place to gain an art education. But to survive there, the young prodigy would have to bend himself to its rigor, its traditions, and above all, its taste.
You were told very much what you had to do, what paint palette you were allowed to use, what subject matter was appropriate for the stage of your learning.
You were meant to be painting portraits, landscapes, genre painting, often perhaps with some kind of moral tale.
Many artists were frustrated by the fact that the teachings of Joshua Reynolds, who died in 1792, were still being taught as the only way to look at art.
But even with these traditionalist teaching techniques, from the beginning, Millet's exceptional eye for detail, the very skill that would shine through in his Ophelia, won him fame and applause.
Millet was a great success at the Royal Academy. Even though he only went in when he was 11, he was winning awards and medals for his drawings and his paintings.
There's a wonderful picture of the Duke of Sussex handing the young Millet his silver medal, and he can hardly see Millet because he's so small. He has to bend down to this little boy who's shown with his lovely gold hairs and his little pantaloons.
Millet excelled at history paintings, big canvases depicting moral themes from well-known stories of the past. In 1846, he exhibited Pizarro seizing the Inca of Peru, and 1 year later, at just 18 years old, he received a gold medal for his painting The Tribe of Benjamin seizing the daughters of Shiloh. By the men at the top, he was adored, and yet, behind its closed doors, Millet was becoming increasingly frustrated with this cramping institution.
Revolutions in art tend to happen after a time of stagnation. And in the 1840s, British painting was frankly in a poor way. Most of the greats, including Constable, were dead. And apart from the elderly Turner, then thought to be in his decline, there was nobody for the young Millet to look up to, which was a great stroke of luck, because it meant he had to rely on his own resources, think harder, and make his own way. Well, I say his own way, but not entirely, because in a second stroke of luck, he was surrounded by a group of equally impatient and almost as talented friends.
Two other young artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt, shared Millet's frustrations with the revered Royal Academy.
They began to be rather critical. They felt that all the students were coming out and they were producing these rather brown, lacklustre paintings, which had no real connection to the society in which they were living.
Unlike all artists, they wanted to go their own way. They wanted to show their own talent.
So in 1848, the trio vowed to work together, igniting an extraordinary period of creativity.
Aged just 19 years old, the teenage Millet was about to transform the story of British painting forever.
And create an image that would shock the mid-Victorian establishment. John Everett Millet's Ophelia is one of the oldest and most popular pieces in Tate Britain's collection.
This painting is so photoreal, so throbbing with vivid, lush colour, that it's hard to remember it owes nothing at all to any camera or lens, but was painted meticulously by hand in the depths of Victorian London more than 150 years ago. It packs an immediate punch. It looks different because it was meant to look different. It was the product of an artistic plot or conspiracy, if you like, that shook the Victorian art world.
And it all began in the summer of 1848 in this small, nondescript house in central London, with three daring young chancers, all under the age of 22. John Everett Millet, William Holman Hunt, and the hot-headed, flashy painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
So these are young rebels. They want to cause a stir, a reaction, and they are defiantly rejecting what they had been taught by an older generation.
They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and even the name was a provocation. The now stale influence of the great Renaissance master Raphael was being cast off by the bold young radicals as a counter-revolution of spirituality based on naturalism now began.
It was very brave of the PRBs to do what they actually did, forming themselves and going against the Royal Academy, but they really believed in themselves.
These young artists who knew they were going to be provocative and they were going to be shocking to the public named themselves PRB, the little initials in the corner, so it's almost like a secret society.
A lot of academicians were really upset and they were quite shocked. You know, we've trained these students and this is what they're producing. They're rejecting us. These artists dismissing these time-honoured conventions of painting.
Within weeks, more like-minded young artists, fascinated by this radical new approach, joined Millet, Rossetti and Hunt. In their paintings, the rebellion unleashed an entirely new palette, paving the way for Millet's Ophelia.
The Pre-Raphaelite movement was revolutionary because their pictures just looked so different to everything else on display. The works were vivid and bright, with colours placed in juxtaposition.
They tried to show things as they really were. One of their tenets was truth to nature. So they would go outside, they would paint in the open air, and they would faithfully record everything that they saw. This was hugely radical.
So their pictures did actually look different, and they immediately demanded attention.
This revolutionary new society made their first big splash with Millet's attention-demanding Christ in the House of His Parents. Now displayed in Tate Britain, it's one of the artist-educator Richard Thomas's favourite pieces.
It went on show at the Royal Academy annual exhibition in May 1850, and he was 20 years old. So this is his coming-of-age exhibition. The first thing that happened for people looking at it was that they were drawn into responding to the subject in the painting as if it was an incident in a perfectly ordinary carpenter's workshop. But that's not just a little boy who's cut his hand. This is the Holy Family with Mary, Jesus and Joseph, and Mary's mother, St. Anne.
Everything about this painting reflected the new and almost extremist principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Millet decided to paint the picture not in his studio, but on location in an actual carpenter's workshop in order to get the authentic feel. To get the effect of the vivid blood, Millet actually cut his own hand. You can see the chipped and dirty toenails of St. Joseph.
He thought this was one of his masterpieces. And until this time, Millet had been adored, so he didn't expect to really get a backlash. But in general, people took against this painting. One of the biggest problems was that Millet had portrayed the Holy Family as working class. This was really, really shocking to people. They didn't like it.
It's failing to do what people expect of a religious painting. It's failing to illustrate the sacred text. It's inserting an additional story. It's daring in a number of ways.
The Virgin Mary is not represented as some beautiful Raphaelesque type. She's shown us as a woman who looks rather sort of haggard and grief-stricken. It would seem to be blasphemous.
Ignoring all the pallid Madonnas and cute Christs that had come before him, Millet's religious realism was entirely unexpected. The Victorians already had a mental image of the Holy Family, and they hadn't looked like this.
One of the biggest critics of this particular painting was Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens was not an art critic. However, he had an awful lot of sway.
And his criticism is utterly hostile. He describes the Christ child as a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy with a bedgown. The Virgin is described as a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England. So he's utterly dismissive of this coarse realism.
The Pre-Raphaelites may only recently have been founded, but thanks to Millet, their reputation was already shot to pieces. News of the scandal even reached Queen Victoria, who demanded to see Millet's blasphemous work for herself. The young artist was devastated.
After the shock of the reception of Christ in the House of His Parents, Millet was determined to make the art world love him again, to get his reputation back. He wasn't going to compromise, but he was going to make sure that his next painting was adored.
And for that, there was no better place for Millet to turn than the theatre.
Theatre was very popular. When people went out for entertainment, they went to the theatre, and Shakespeare was extremely popular.
It was a bit of everything that the Victorians liked. There was death involved, there was love involved, a bit of almost eroticism.
The Victorian public adored their Shakespeare. Even those who couldn't read had been to the theatre and were well versed in his stories. So as the topic for story painting, Shakespeare was a shrewd choice, especially as Millet plucked out one of the most dramatic moments in one of the most popular plays of them all.
So this is the famous moment in Shakespeare's Hamlet when Hamlet's beloved Ophelia decides to kill herself. She has been driven mad because Hamlet appears no longer to love her and has been mocking her in a rather cruel way, and he has just killed her father. So for her, life is over.
It was a really popular subject with artists. A lot of artists known to Millet, Arthur Hughes, Richard Redgrave, had painted the death of Ophelia. But they'd done it in a picturesque way, where she's sort of just tripping over the bank and stepping into the water.
Millet, however, took a closer look at Shakespeare's immortal lines.
Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto the element, but long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death.
Snatches of old songs, the waterlogged dress, inconsolable in her misery. Bound by the Brotherhood's rules, Millet wanted to bring all of this vividly to life. But to do that, he needed the perfect poor wretch, a model whose face he dearly hoped would become unforgettable. The answer to his Ophelia was a young hat seller called Lizzie Siddal.
Lizzie Siddal was working in a milliner's shop just off Leicester Square in London, and she was a rather unusual-looking woman for her time. She was a young woman who was very, very slim.
Long red hair, very pale skin, very tall. She was discovered by Millet's friend, who went to the milliner's and saw her and just thought she'd be perfect for the pre-Raphaelites. And she became their model. But she was also an artist in her own right.
She was quite intellectual and loved poetry, painting.
Rossetti loved her, Millet loved her. Everybody wanted to paint her.
She essentially became the pre-Raphaelite supermodel.
Millet now had his Ophelia, but how would he transform a 22-year-old Victorian hat seller into his doomed Shakespearean? How could he bring his canvas to life unless his model lived and breathed her distress? Ophelia and her watery suicide had to feel real. It was the beginning of a painstaking process as carefully planned as any military maneuver.
It wasn't just the figure that was important, so like Ophelia. The background was just as important.
The scene in Hamlet takes place in a remote corner of Denmark, but Millet needed somewhere a little handier for central London. Today, his great-great-grandson, art historian Dr. Roger Bowdler, is retracing Millet's steps for the first time.
Oh, my goodness. It's just a fabulous feeling, actually having found the precise spot where he spent weeks and weeks and weeks in the summer of 1851 painting Ophelia, and it's here. And this isn't the most romantic or glamorous of settings. You know, you can hear the M3 in the background, it's in the edge of Greater London, and it's covered in litter. But actually, that almost makes the magic of the picture the greater. The drama is about her imminent sinking below the water. So he doesn't want a grand, picturesque setting. He wants rather a modest riverbank to paint, and that's just what he finds.
To work outside, Millet capitalized on two exciting new innovations: small portable paint tubes and a host of new pigments and colors. His Ophelia would be the brightest canvas he'd ever produced, but working for so long outdoors still brought with it a whole catalogue of challenges.
He would spend up to 11 hours a day in great discomfort. He complained about the flies, about being threatened by a big bull.
He had farmers shouting at him. People would come past and ask him what he was doing.
And he has to deal with this pair of swans. They take up station just where he's found his spots and completely muck up the water weeds that he's so carefully selected for the setting of the painting.
Millet wrote, "My martyrdom is more trying than any I have hitherto experienced. Certainly, the painting of a picture under such circumstances would be a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging." These were the lengths the Pre-Raphaelites were willing to go to in order to capture nature as truthfully as possible.
He paints with fantastic finesse, which is why it takes him so long. So he begins work on this in early July. He's still here in early December.
He would say that it was like completing the size of a 5-penny piece each day. So that gives you a sense of how slow and gradual this process was.
He's putting his all into it because his reputation depends on success. So there's a discipline at work, along with the very romantic, poetic engagement of this poignant scene of watery death in this river.
But while Millet himself was more than happy to suffer for his art, even he realized that persuading Lizzie to dunk herself for hours in the cold and dirty waters of a Thames tributary might be going a little too far. And so back in central London, he came up with a somewhat less unpleasant alternative, but only somewhat.
Millet poses her in his studio, in his parents' house, in a bathtub, and he finds in an antique shop a beautiful antique dress with silver embroidery. Elizabeth Siddal is posed wearing this in the bathtub.
Now, Lizzie was being painted in December, long before central heating, and it was cold. It was in a basement studio. The lamps underneath the bath were kept lit in order to keep the water at an even temperature. But one day, Millet didn't notice that the lamps had gone out. The water, of course, just got colder and colder, and Lizzie lay there, the perfect artist model, suffering for his art as he completed his picture.
Millet's quest for realism had given his muse pneumonia. But although he was forced to pay for Lizzie's doctor's bills, there may have been a dark part of him that was quietly and privately pleased.
I think that the fact that Lizzie Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism and naturalism to the face that he painted while she was lying there in the bath, freezing.
Millet had thrown everything at this piece, stretching himself to the limits of his already extraordinary abilities. And yet it had almost cost the life of his model, and even after months of toil, he still wasn't finished. This was perhaps his last chance to not only save his reputation, but that of his fellow Pre-Raphaelites. So would his Ophelia be the great hit that Millet craved? John Everett Millet's Ophelia, the jewel in Tate Britain's collection, may be one of the most popular pieces of art of the 19th century, but it's definitely not for everyone.
There is something about this picture, perhaps its extreme prettiness, a dash of sentimentality that does not quite work for me. Perhaps I'm already too old. That is, when I first started looking at paintings and loving paintings back in the 1970s, modernism was all the rage, and Victorian pictures telling stories were deeply unfashionable. But we all have to challenge our prejudices, don't we? And it may be strange thought, unlikely thought, that I am completely wrong.
And with this iconic canvas and its exquisite detail all to myself, it's very hard not to appreciate the sheer artistry.
So first of all, this is about two things for which the Pre-Raphaelites are very well known. Rich, luscious, almost enamelled colour, and a detail so sharp you could cut your fingers on it. Where in the history of art have you ever seen a green as greeny as that green? Not since the very early Renaissance, I think. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the detail of the foliage is extraordinary. At times, he must have been using a brush with a single hair.
And so, yes, perhaps, I may have been a little hasty. Looking again with fresh eyes, the subject is creepy, but it's impossible not to admire the way Millet makes his colours glow and his brushes dance. A touch of blue here, a flicker of white there. He applies shades and highlights with nerveless accuracy.
He managed somehow, with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites, to wash and rinse the colours so they glowed more freely and brightly than they had for a very, very long time. And they astonished the Victorians, and frankly, they are still astonishing us today.
There is this remarkable kind of hyper-real quality in the painting. And one of the ways he achieved this effect was to use a white ground, using lead white and zinc white. And the effect of that was to create this kind of backlit quality to these very bright primary colors that he's using.
And the wonderful passages of observation, those two hands, which will stand out like pieces of collage on the canvas. And it really conveys the impression of, this water just sinking into the dress. It's just dragging her bit by bit under the water.
The Pre-Raphaelites' hopes for a new art live in every inch of this canvas. It throbs with zest and confidence. It is everything the movement had hoped painting could be. It took Millet months, but finally, in early 1852, Ophelia was finished.
The question for Millet was now, was it worth it? Would the Victorian public feel half as strongly about this astonishing picture as did the artist himself?
When the painting went on display at the Royal Academy in 1852, there was a very mixed reaction, actually.
Some people thought it was a very unconventional representation of Ophelia. Someone described her death as if she were in a weedy ditch. Others felt it was just too bright, vivid and gaudy.
There was so much going on, so much symbolism, that viewers almost had to work at it. They had to study it really hard. And at first, people were a little bit shocked, but within a very short time, it was applauded.
People thought Millet has really captured something quite extraordinary. Tom Taylor, who wrote for The Times, when he saw the face of Ophelia, he just described himself as just crying with emotion because he'd made the death so beautiful.
Millet's masterpiece had been quickly snapped up by a private collector, but while it remained on public display, Ophelia proved to be a huge draw. And whether they liked it or not, the Royal Academy could no longer cast out its arrogant prodigal son.
The painting is really important in terms of Millet's career. It marks a watershed. Suddenly, his paintings become emotional, and he becomes seen as a painter of pathos and empathy. And there are accounts of people just become overcome with emotion at seeing Ophelia. And at that point, his reputation changes. And from this point onwards, it's really an upward trajectory.
Just a year after Ophelia was displayed, Millet was chosen as an Academy Associate, an act which would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The establishment he had rejected and which had loudly rejected him was suddenly embracing the stiff-backed young radical. But if Ophelia had been about tapping into popular taste, then, unfortunately, Millet now didn't know when to stop.
So from 1853 onwards, Millet starts to feel that he doesn't have to stick entirely to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's principles. He sticks to a lot of them, but he starts to experiment.
He becomes a highly successful commercial artist, a painter of genre scenes, of landscapes. His style relaxes, but also I think he becomes just bored, dissatisfied with that pre-Raphaelite, very finicky manner. He wants to develop as an artist. Artists always have to change and evolve.
He became a fashionable portraitist, painting rich people's portraits, and a lot of artists said that he sold out, but he was making a living.
Most of the public just loved him. They couldn't get enough of Millet. He started to paint a lot of crowd-pleasing pictures, often of little children, because that was the fashion.
He becomes the darling of the British public.
A revolutionary no longer, Millet's later work, which even included a saccharin advert for Pear's soap, bore no relation to his pre-Raphaelite canvases. He became firmly part of the establishment. In 1896, aged 67, he was even elected Royal Academy President. But whereas Ophelia had once represented the peak of the pre-Raphaelite movement in all its non-conformist glory, now it marked the beginning of their demise. Holman Hunt and the increasingly eccentric Rossetti would be left to forge their own paths, and their great muse Lizzie, immortalized in their paintings, would begin a terrifying parallel trajectory in real life. Millet's painting had almost killed her, and now she was going to become Ophelia-like in an entirely new way.
People clamoured to come and see this painting. And in fact, for Lizzie Siddal, in some ways, it was a double-edged sword. She became very famous because of it.
Through her association with Rossetti, she really begins to pick up her art again, painting and drawings, often portraying scenes of lovers or couples in complicated psychological situations. She also starts to write her own poetry and verse.
Lizzie was a sophisticated pre-Raphaelite artist in her own right, much more than the model in the movement's most iconic piece. But her relationship with Rossetti was incredibly tempestuous. He was a serial cheat, and Lizzie didn't make the easiest partner herself.
Perhaps the biggest problem in their relationship on her side was that she was a laudanum addict. And laudanum was an opiate. It was opium in alcohol, incredibly addictive. And it was a real social ill of the 19th century, particularly amongst women.
Depressed, unappreciated, and darkly miserable, Lizzie could not control her addiction. And tragically, on the 11th of February, 1862, aged just 32, she killed herself with a suspected overdose.
People have often associated the tragic early death of Elizabeth Siddal with the early death of Ophelia. So there is this conflation between art and life. That's what's so sort of magical and sort of, slightly sort of sinister or uncanny about pre-Raphaelite paintings. Often art and life do converge.
When Lizzie was buried, Rossetti did a very romantic gesture. He placed in her coffin, between her cheek and her hair, his only copy of his poems that he'd written. He claimed that they were all about her, that love had died with her. He was deeply grief-stricken.
With Ophelia sold and in private hands, the pre-Raphaelites disbanded, and Millet now creating mainstream art for the masses, it looked as if the importance and significance of this remarkable painting would start to fade.
But neither Lizzie Siddal nor Millet's Ophelia were going to be forgotten, because something was about to happen in that graveyard which would lodge the young model and the painting deep in the Victorian popular imagination.
Millet's great canvas, Ophelia, has continued to capture our imagination almost 170 years since it was first exhibited. And I think that's in part because its subject matter transcends any age or any era.
There is no moment in the human story so cold, so lonely, and so bleak as deciding to take your own life. Ophelia killed herself because she had been so badly betrayed she was demented. And she did it in a particularly grim way.
But what also added to the intrigue, mystery, and perhaps the popularity of this canvas was that it was an act reflected by the untimely death of Millet's own muse. And Victorian Britain would be aghast at what happened next.
Lizzie Siddal was buried in Highgate Cemetery, Rossetti's handwritten poetry tucked neatly behind her long flowing red hair. But this tragic woman was not going to be allowed to rest in peace, because just 6 years later, Rossetti decided that he wanted his poetry back, which was tricky, because you could hardly dig her up again. Or could he?
By 1869, Rossetti couldn't bear the thought of his pre-Raphaelite poetry being lost to the world any longer. And so alongside his friend Charles Augustus Howell, he hatched a macabre plan to retrieve the poems from Lizzie's grave.
They'd done it by bonfire light, and the coffin had been exhumed and the lid had been taken off. And allegedly, according to Howell, there was Lizzie perfect. She wasn't a skeleton, she was miraculously preserved. He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin. Rossetti wanted to believe it, that Lizzie was the beautiful supermodel in death, just as she'd been in life.
Rossetti published the poems, which he'd received with a wormhole running through them. They didn't go down well. By the time he died 13 years later, he was a thin spectre of the man who'd helped found the Pre-Raphaelites back in 1848. And yet, a mythology began to grow around the image of Lizzie, captured for eternity as the epitome of the betrayed woman.
She's sort of a heroine for women that suffered at the fate of drugs and men and being a muse.
A lot of women now model themselves on Elizabeth Siddal, and the Elizabeth Siddal look is now rather fashionable. If you think of performers such as Florence Welch with the red hair, pale complexion, the flowing garments.
Perhaps one reason why Lizzie Siddal still captures the imagination is that her own suicide is so neatly captured in the painting of her by Millet as Ophelia. The fact that she was the most famous suicide in art history and then becomes a suicide in real life is something that continues to resonate with people.
There's no denying this is a great Victorian horror story. But Lizzie Siddal, the face of the pre-Raphaelite movement, should not be remembered just as a beautiful victim.
We look at Lizzie Siddal in this picture, and she is entirely passive, almost surrendered. And we have to remember that this was a woman who, in her real life, was an artist and a writer, a poet herself. It is a great, great injustice that the way we remember her is only as a passive, sinking woman in a famous painting and as a corpse being ravaged for somebody else's poetry long after her death.
And yet, even now, Lizzie couldn't quite rest in peace. The painting of Ophelia had vanished into the private art world not long after it had been completed. But now it had reached the eye of one very important man.
In 1892, Henry Tate purchases the picture. Henry Tate is a sugar magnate. He's made his fortune from sugar refining. He patents the sugar cube.
There was only one thing that Tate loved more than sugar: art, and in particular, pre-Raphaelite art. Over the last few years, he'd collected an extraordinary number of paintings. And now, he wanted to share them with the nation.
He loved the idea of a national gallery that people of all social classes could go to.
A site is decided upon, which is the old Millbank Penitentiary. It's a site which will be transformed into this public gallery, which will be free of charge for the public, particularly for the working poor of the Millbank area.
A cutting-edge art gallery in one of the poorest areas of the city. That was a mighty risk. The question on everyone's lips was, would Ophelia help pull in big crowds? And the answer was a resounding yes.
The gallery opens in 1897, and Ophelia is an immediate hit with the public. People flock to see it.
It was one of those that people were told to sort of stand back, don't jostle. They had to have a lot of guards checking that people didn't get too close to the painting. And it's remained one of the most successful paintings of the Tate ever since.
This haunting canvas has spoken to generation after generation since it was first hung here more than 120 years ago.
Millet's Ophelia is a masterwork by a master painter. He was a young revolutionary taking on the establishment, and then, very quickly, the perils of success. He became the establishment himself, and he was much mocked for turning out cute, sentimental pictures, some of them used in advertising as sweet as any sugar cube manufactured by Sir Henry Tate himself. But this here still shows all his defiance and his optimism. It is a young man's shout hanging on these establishment walls. No, I still don't love it, but I salute it for its vividness and its energy. And anyway, Ma, you old fool, the rest of the world disagrees.
Next time.
This was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors.
The story of a ravishing beauty and the revolution she stirred.
He would have put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
This could only be Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe,
there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power.
Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? Florence. Home to one of the oldest art galleries in the world, the Uffizi. Every year, millions of people flock to see masterpieces by Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Artists so famous they're known by their first names alone. But there's a painting here that's more copied, caricatured, and argued about than any other. And it's not by any of them. It's a painting that arouses physical reactions. In 2018, one man even had a heart attack in front of it. It's one of the most famous female images in the world, and one of the oddest. This is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus.
Now then, full disclosure. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, I have not been able to go myself and stand in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. As it happens, Botticelli's Birth of Venus is a painting I have seen in the flesh plenty of times. And although, luckily, it has not yet given me a heart attack, I can report that it packs a powerful emotional punch.
It's a simple enough looking composition telling the story of the birth of the Roman goddess Venus out at sea, and shows her wafting to shore as only goddesses may on a giant scallop shell blown by the god of wind, Zephyr. Simple or not, it's heart-stoppingly radiant.
Yet this masterpiece by Botticelli hasn't always been one of the world's most celebrated and most visited canvases. In fact, surprisingly, for more than 300 years, it was effectively packed away. And to understand why, we have to go back to the period when it was first made, not the period of birth, but of rebirth, or to give it the fancy French name, the Renaissance.
This world-shifting cultural, artistic and scientific upheaval turned Europe on its head in the 15th century. And at the heart of that radical transformation was Florence, birthplace of Alessandro di Mariano Filippi, who arrived into this revolutionary world of artistic opportunity in 1445. So, who was he? Well, we know him better by his family nickname, Sandro Botticelli.
Botticelli received his nickname from his brother. It means little barrel.
It's actually quite a mean nickname. I mean, you can imagine this really horrid elder brother giving him this nickname.
Some people say it was because he was a bit tubby. Other people say because they all liked to have a drink at the time. But yeah, little barrel stuck. Botticelli loved art from a really early age. His father was a tanner, so very creative, working with his hands. And Botticelli loved anything that was visual, aesthetic.
He's not obviously a child prodigy when it comes to art, but eventually sort of focuses on painting.
So he went and did a training apprentice with a monk, Fra Filippo Lippi. He was a little bit crazy, but he was brilliant.
Fra Filippo Lippi was an eccentric friar. He'd been brought up by nuns and captured by pirates and was infamous for his sexual adventures. But despite all of that, he was one of Florence's biggest artistic talents.
He introduced Botticelli to the wonders of colour and narrative and symbolism in art, and Botticelli loved it.
The little barrel had found his calling. Under Lippi's tuition, he flourished into a skilled and diligent painter.
His detailed, stylised way of working, the way he made everything look very beautiful, were really admired, and it happened very quickly that he was sought after.
It didn't take long for Botticelli to set up on his own, and his choice of address would be key to his Birth of Venus, because among his close neighbours were a wealthy family called the Vespucci. Caterina Romai is a specialist in Renaissance Italy.
This is Via del Porcellana, where Botticelli got his workshop. All these ground floors of the houses that you see today were originally workshops. Still today, full of artisans. So it's one area of the city that didn't change much from the Renaissance to today. This is supposed to be the house of Botticelli, where he worked. These explain very well the relation between the Vespucci and Botticelli, because the house is located exactly in the back of the Vespucci Palace. The working class live here, and they work for the wealthiest people living in the palaces on the two ends of Via del Porcellana. The workshop of Botticelli was full of life. It was a real shop. So the patrons, the wealthiest people, in this case the Vespucci, go to the workshop of Botticelli. They tell to him what they would like to have. We would like to have a Madonna painted with the baby Jesus. And the Vespucci are the first important clients who commission important objects to Botticelli.
In these early years, Botticelli created endless pious paintings of Mary the Madonna and other religious scenes. But although strictly Catholic in nature, his art couldn't help but be influenced by the world going past his window. Here in the National Gallery in London is one of his many Adoration of the Kings, painted when Botticelli was in his 20s.
For me, this is an almost perfect summation of what Florentine society was like during Botticelli's lifetime. It is first and foremost a Christian religious society, and there is the Virgin Mary with the Christ child at the absolute center of the painting. But in front of them, there is a great swirling crowd of absolutely up-to-the-minute, spiffy, modern, very fashionable Florentines. They're there in their extraordinary hats, bright red tights, the velvet hose, the doublets. It's a very, very fashionable, highly materialistic, modern society. But what is hanging over all of them? The arches and the pillars of the ancient world, classical, pagan Greece and Rome. This is a vibrant, materialistic, modern society, but always, always in the shadow of the pagans.
For Botticelli, it would be the meeting of these two worlds, his closest neighbours and the mythology of ancient Italy, that would prompt him to create the most important and daring work of his entire career, his astonishing Birth of Venus. Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus is among the most instantly recognizable masterpieces to come out of Renaissance Florence. This figure has become a universal visual shorthand for beauty, but there's more to Botticelli's goddess than meets the eye.
There is a face in Botticelli's art very, very similar to his Venus, which appears again and again. This is a very good example, his Venus and Mars of 1485, and here she is with her long hair and her absolutely unmistakable face. Who the devil was she? Well, remarkably, extraordinarily, we think we know. In Florence, she was an immigrant from faraway Genoa, and her name was Simonetta.
So how did beautiful Simonetta come into the life of Botticelli, the little barrel? Well, his whole life, Botticelli lived and worked within just a few streets in the Santa Maria Novella district of Florence, cheek by jowl with his neighbours, the Vespucci. And it was a son of the family, Marco, who brought the 15-year-old girl with the haunting face onto the streets of Renaissance Florence.
Marco married Simonetta Cataneo, who's from a very influential family in Genoa, and she comes to Florence in about 1468. It wasn't all that common for Florentine families to marry out of the city. She was something of a novelty, this person who nobody knew already turning up, and she evidently becomes this kind of famous beauty within the city.
She became a massive celebrity. Everyone wanted to see her, wanted to look at her. She was described as the most beautiful woman in Florence.
Their jaws dropped, their eyes popped out of their heads. It was almost, cartoon-like. Why was she so appealing? She was so beautiful.
It was as if a teenage Marilyn Monroe had moved in next door to Andy Warhol. But though Botticelli would seize Simonetta's image for his most famous painting, it would take the intervention of an even more powerful family than the Vespucci to tie their fates together. A family so famous and so rich, they're built into the very fabric of Florence. The Medici.
I would describe the Medici as the leading oligarchs of Florence. They're bankers to the popes, and they do so well in Florentine politics that they essentially become the rulers of the city.
The Medici ruled Florence for 60 years, from effectively 1434 until 1494. So we have something quite unique at this point. We have a family who were bankers. They're not princes, they're not warriors. They've not come to power through the force of arms.
Whatever you say about them, they definitely believed in Florence and Florence's greatness.
The only way to make it big in this great city was to grab the Medici's attention, attract that, and Botticelli would, like the florin itself, be minted. His chance came when he was commissioned to paint a nativity, or adoration of the baby Jesus, by another family equally keen to curry favour with the rulers of Florence.
Botticelli paints an adoration for the Del Lama family. And this is a really interesting commission. Now, it's quite common in this period that you put in little figures into these religious paintings to represent the donors. But Botticelli goes a lot further than that. The kings who are bringing gold and frankincense and myrrh are actually figures from the Medici family. It isn't directly a Medici commission. Clearly, however, somebody wants to sort of suck up to the leading oligarchs of Florence.
The somebodies who are buttering up the Medici are also in the composition, both looking directly out at the viewer. Gaspare del Lama is pointing at himself as if in answer to the question, who paid for this? And below him, standing proud, is Botticelli. This self-portrait is one of the only pictures of Botticelli we have today. But his smart, calculated depiction of the Medici as the three wise men certainly got him noticed. And just as he'd gained their attention, so had his beautiful young neighbour, the woman who'd inspire his Birth of Venus, Simonetta Vespucci.
A couple of the Medici boys were in love with Simonetta, and they used to have jousting competitions and tournaments every few years. And Botticelli painted her portrait for the banner of one of the Medici boys who won the competition. And when he won it, he said, I won it not just for me, but I won it for the beauty of Simonetta.
Simonetta was just as inspiring for Botticelli. She had become his ideal muse, the perfection of human beauty. But if this was an artistic match made in heaven, it wasn't one for this earth. Great beauty doesn't last long, certainly not on the disease-ridden streets of 15th century Florence. A year after the joust, aged 23, Simonetta died of tuberculosis. Her funeral procession drew massive crowds yearning for a glimpse of their Simonetta. She was displayed in an open casket.
Thousands of people followed her coffin. People mourned her, I suppose as we do for a great celebrity. People felt they knew her, felt they loved her because of her beauty.
Because she actually doesn't live out her years. I think perhaps along the same lines as you might think about for Marilyn Monroe or Princess Diana. The famous beauty reputation is then enhanced, and she becomes a kind of idealized beauty.
Simonetta had melted hearts all over Florence. Now Botticelli determinedly kept her memory alive by painting her again and again. Taking his behavior at face value, Sandro, like his clients, seems to have been completely obsessed.
Botticelli very rarely strayed from her image. If he's going to paint females, either Venus or the Virgin Mary, he wanted to paint the most beautiful woman he possibly could imagine, and to him, she was that.
Botticelli painted Simonetta time and time again because she was so popular. The men that couldn't have her physically could have a likeness of her. She was beauty and perfection. She was the pin-up.
And it was a strategy that worked. With the beauty of his rich compositions and the skill of his portraiture, Botticelli was now highly in demand. He was even asked by the Pope to paint frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. But his rich Florentine patrons were getting bored of religious work after religious work. So for his next commission, Botticelli created something very different. It's called Primavera, or Spring, and this 1480 masterpiece is a remarkable rehearsal for the birth of Venus. Brimming with juicy exuberance, it shows Venus, goddess of love, celebrating the arrival of spring in a flowery forest. And if she looks familiar, it is, of course, because she is almost certainly Simonetta.
This does seem to be Botticelli being very original. It is a large secular painting of ancient mythological figures, and that is very new.
Primavera was a radical departure for Italian art. It's one of the first paintings in the Western world made solely for pleasure, where there is no moral tale, no deep religious message. It's only to be enjoyed.
I mean, this is a very expensive commission as well in terms of the materials that are being used. There is gold in there is azurite, and there's also a phenomenal attention to detail. I think there are about 130 specified types of flower scattered across that garden in the Primavera, which is quite extraordinary.
Who commissioned it has been much debated, but what we do know is that this decadent mythical scene was eventually displayed in the bedroom of Lorenzo de' Medici. The artist who would soon embark on his iconic Birth of Venus was now clearly marked out as a painter willing to take risks.
Primavera opened up Botticelli to a whole world of mythological subjects. And here in Venus and Mars, painted just afterwards, he's at it again. This is a languorous, lush, and absolutely non-Christian subject.
Based on another well-known myth, here Venus reclines on a cushion, whilst Mars, the god of war, sleeps so deeply he appears to be snoring.
Venus and Mars may be the most convincing post-coital image ever made, but it also demonstrates so much of how Botticelli made his art and why he's so famous today.
Painted around the same time, all the techniques Botticelli would bring to the Birth of Venus are also evident here.
First of all, that extraordinary drawing. I mean, he is the great drawer of all the greatest painters. He has a line which is absolutely accurate, entirely beautiful, but as sharp as if it was done with a scalpel. It's extraordinary. He has great, rich colour, fantastic attention to detail. That grass would prick your feet, and it's full of great wit. He's a very funny man and a very funny painter when he wants to be. With these works, we're not in the real world. We're in a kind of magical, idealized forest. Botticelli is pushing Renaissance ideas about beauty and love to a new place.
And he wasn't done pushing yet, because while Primavera and Venus and Mars were surprising, with the Birth of Venus, Botticelli was about to create something downright scandalous. The Birth of Venus is one of the most recognizable paintings in the world. Starring Florentine beauty Simonetta Vespucci, these days it's seen as a pretty conventional masterpiece of Renaissance art. But when it was painted by Sandro Botticelli in the late 15th century, it was completely revolutionary.
The painting was a truly radical commission, life-size nude, on a canvas, and also not of a Christian woman.
A painting like The Birth of Venus was seen as taking a great liberty and, oh my goodness, what is this artist doing?
Botticelli had already defied the norm with his pagan paintings Primavera and Venus and Mars. So why was The Birth of Venus seen as quite so bonkers? Well, simply because no one had painted a nude like this before, one that asked that most fundamental of questions: what is art for? To praise God or to give mankind enjoyment?
Botticelli was one of the most sought-after artists in northern Italy. His sinuous drawing and the grace of his brushwork meant that even in a picture-saturated, image-drenched world, his paintings were fresh and surprising. But even for Botticelli, the birth of Venus was one heck of a gamble.
And the reason for that is entirely about what was acceptable in the Catholic world in which Botticelli lived.
I think it's important to distinguish between the nude, which is something that happens in art, and merely naked bodies. Because in terms of naked bodies, they are found all across Italian painting well before Botticelli. But mostly they are there for a very different purpose. They're there to remind us all of the unhappy and undignified truth of our lives.
Almost all works of art from the years before Botticelli painted The Birth of Venus had a moral or Christian theme, especially those including naked figures.
And so here, for instance, all the naked people are in hell, squirming, writhing. Even in Masaccio's very, very famous painting of Adam and Eve being expelled, Adam, well, his genitals are on full display. He's not hiding himself there. He's hiding his face to show his shame. Eve is covering herself. Her face is just a rictus of despair and horror. Nothing in any way titillating about it. They're there basically to say we are clothed in flesh, all of us, and we are rotting, which you may agree is not a profoundly erotic thought.
And yet, The Birth of Venus is a painting clearly all about stirring up erotic thoughts and feelings. And so to do that, Botticelli had to use every technique he'd acquired. By mixing alabaster powder into his paint, he added a shimmering quality to his brushwork. The highlights are emphasized with gold leaf, details that must have seemed almost luminescent in the Florentine sunshine. But it's the attention he pays to his central figure which is most arresting.
He painted her in a stance that was taken from the ancient Greeks. She's standing in what's known as the Venus pudica stance, where she's covering up all her private areas. Her hair is covering her modesty.
She's beautiful, but is she? She's got very long legs that if she tried to walk away from the painting, she actually wouldn't be able to stand up. And her arms are extra, extra long. And she has no shoulders, they're sloping. And they go right up from the arms to the neck. And the reason being is because necks were considered a very attractive spot on a female, an area to be seduced and planted with little kisses. And that's why her neck goes all the way down her arms to her long legs.
In this painting, Botticelli created an image unlike anything seen before by Florentine society. And yet, unlike his Adoration of the Magi or the work in Rome's Sistine Chapel, this was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors.
The fact that it was designed to be seen only by a few might explain why Botticelli felt he could get away with this. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Fine. But a shamelessly nude woman on a clamshell, and yes, there is a metaphor there, blowing in from the sea? Sandro, really? Would it be too much for his clients to stomach? Well, it's known to have been kept quietly in a Medici palace.
Birth of Venus would have gone into a private chamber in this Villa di Castello outside of Florence. Wouldn't have been seen by many people.
It was probably commissioned for a wedding, and it was probably to hang behind the bed, the marital bed.
Probably hidden behind velvet curtains, a sort of foreplay, if you like, a bit of a tease, a sexual tease.
But even though it was kept out of the way of prying eyes, Botticelli's radical Birth of Venus still had an impact far beyond the bedroom where it was hanging.
The Medici's friends, as we know, were in a great circle of very influential people, and also other artists would have known about it, talked about it, seen it in Botticelli's studio. From then on, artists began to paint nudes more readily.
Botticelli's Birth of Venus had a huge impact on other artists. It opened the floodgates for other artists to realise that they didn't have to just paint religious narrative. And at the time, artists like Titian and Giorgione would have thought, yes, let's paint the nude.
Now in middle age, the artistic revolutionary Sandro Botticelli had the world at his feet. But a very different revolution was about to break out in Florence. For years, the city had been a playground for the ultra-rich, obsessed with splashing the cash on showy materialistic luxuries. But as the decadence of their lifestyles reached a fever pitch of extravagance, Florence became a powder keg of class resentment. Enter Girolamo, the mad monk, Savonarola, who arrived to light its fuse with a verbal flamethrower.
Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara, north of Florence. He was a mesmeric preacher. He was really a fire-breathing fundamentalist who was preaching for a reform of the church.
He is quite concerned for the moral welfare of the city, and he has a lot to say about that.
The church was corrupt, the political institutions of Florence were corrupt, and he wanted both of them to be reformed.
He disapproves of gambling, he disapproves of card playing, he disapproves of sodomy, he disapproves of all sorts of, women wearing too much makeup, certainly sex outside marriage, all these bad things that Florence is doing which can only get the city into trouble.
Savonarola was not opposed to all art. He believed art had a purpose within Christianity, but he believed that art was devotional. What he did not want to have on the walls of churches were images of the Virgin Mary in which she looked, as he said, like a harlot.
He doesn't like all this pagan art, as he calls it, the art that draws on classical myths, whether that is poetry or whether it's visual art.
The preacher's hellfire sermons cast a spell over everyone who listened to them.
We do know that Botticelli seems to have stepped back from a lot of his artwork under Savonarola and to have been something of a supporter.
Botticelli was mesmerized by him and completely believed his message about reform and about the decadence of art.
And no painting would have looked more decadent than his own Birth of Venus. Maria Antonia Rinaldi is a Florentine expert in the years of Savonarola's domination.
This square, at the time of Savonarola and Botticelli, around 1497, 1498, was the witness, we can say, of quite incredible events. The preaching of Savonarola became more effective over the people of Florence. Objects that he considered sinful were banished from the town. Playing cards, tarots, dices, mythological paintings. Savonarola created this kind of little army of young kids who were dressed in white and with a red cross, and who were little spies around the town who were telling him if someone still keeping objects that were considered sinful.
On the morning of February the 7th, this rabid zealotry reached fever pitch, and Savonarola's miniature army of child soldiers ransacked the city of all those objects he deemed wicked.
And here there was a huge pyre, around 15 meters for 20 meters. There was on the top the representation of the devil. And all these objects, chairs, perfumes, fabric, books, and a painting with mythological imagery would be burnt. This entire fire was called the bonfire of vanity. Botticelli himself brought to the bonfire of vanities some of his paintings to be burned.
I think we can probably safely assume that given his admiration for Savonarola, he would, had he still had the Birth of Venus in his studio or in his house, taken that giant, beautiful work of art and put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
The master of the beautiful nude was hypnotized. He would never paint another secular image like his Birth of Venus again. And that remained true even when Savonarola's reign of terror proved to be short-lived.
It's a little bit too much for people within Florence who get a bit sick of sort of religious austerity. It gets a little bit too much for the Pope, who thinks that Savonarola has gone too far and is a heretic. And in 1498, it all comes to a head, and Savonarola is arrested, charged with heresy, forced to confess, and is burnt at the stake.
And exactly here we have the plaque commemorating the spot where in 1498 Girolamo Savonarola was hanged and burnt, a little bit more than 1 year after his bonfire of vanity.
The execution of his guru destroyed Botticelli, who had lost commissions and his income because of his born-again religious fervour. His world slowly caved in on itself.
He goes back to working in what often seems rather old-fashioned style, and he's quite rapidly eclipsed by artists working in a new style. People like Raphael, like Leonardo da Vinci, and a little bit later on, Michelangelo.
The last decade of Botticelli's life simply ebbed away.
He'd been surrounded by the whole of the Medici court. He'd been feted as the greatest artist. But by the time he died, he was crippled, he was poor, he lost popularity. It was a complete fall from grace. He died a lonely, poor man.
Botticelli's death was a sad end for the man who'd been one of the brightest stars of the early Renaissance. For the next 300 years, though Botticelli's name was never entirely forgotten, his reputation faded and his canvases gathered dust in neglected corners. He suffered that special purgatory for artists to be remembered by the academics and almost nobody else. It would take a radical artistic movement in England and a painting hanging here in the National Gallery in London to restore his place in the pantheon of the greatest painters and allow his Venus to be reborn for the world to enjoy.
After Botticelli died a forgotten pauper in 1510, his astonishing, magical Birth of Venus was quickly forgotten, seemingly lost to the world forever.
That is, until the middle of the 19th century, when a British collector, William Fuller Maitland, splashed out all of £80 on another Botticelli canvas, the beautiful Mystic Nativity.
William Fuller Maitland was delighted with his purchase. He liked it so much that in 1857 he decided to loan it to the Art Treasures exhibition in Manchester. Over the next 140 days, more than 1.3 million visitors saw Botticelli's painting, and it set the mid-Victorian art world aflame.
The Mystic Nativity gave the Victorians something that had been missing from British art, frankly, for centuries: an emotional directness, a lightness of touch, even a kind of wit. This is a painting about the apocalypse and the end of time, and yet also playful. There's Mary looking absolutely exhausted, strung out like a real mother as she prays over the Christ child, who is rather tubby and very, very squirmy. There's something lovable even about the 7 devils squirming off to hell. It's human and direct and simple and fresh.
And the British public couldn't get enough of it.
All of a sudden, it was almost like Botticelli mania. People would just sort of fall over themselves to go and see this painting.
Among those caught up in the excitement were a group of young British painters and poets. Botticelli and Simonetta were reborn in the work of John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
Artists that became known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were fascinated by the way he worked. Botticelli became their favourite artist because of the delicate way he painted, because of the jewel-bright works that he produced.
They were so in awe of him that he was their main inspiration. He was showing beauty, he was showing love, he was showing the aesthetics of picture making.
But the way the Mystic Nativity showcases Botticelli's skill and importance in the story of British painting isn't the only reason this canvas matters so much. It also led directly to revived interest in the birth of Venus. It led to the rebirth of the birth of Venus.
Lit by a ferocious passion for the Renaissance master, Botticelli's new admirers flocked to Florence. And as they entered the Uffizi, they came face to face with the most astonishing of all his works. Here was the birth of Venus. Rescued from the depths of a Medici palace in the early 19th century, for years this canvas had been almost ignored by the gallery's visitors. Now its popularity skyrocketed. Within just a couple of years, she was the most popular exhibit, a position she still holds today. And just around the corner, Botticelli's final resting place is still visited by hundreds of his smitten worshippers. Maya Gattan is a Botticelli specialist.
We're standing in front of the Church of the Ognissanti in Florence. This was Botticelli's parish church. His house was just really around the corner. He spent just about all of his working life near this church. And he is also buried in this church. And people come to Botticelli's tomb to pay their respects as a kind of pilgrimage. The spot that he's buried is right over here behind this wall. And Simonetta Vespucci was buried also in this church, very nearby Botticelli's grave, because her family, the Vespucci, were parishioners, and their family tombs were here as well. Due to some poetry that was written at the time of her death, Botticelli was thought to have wanted to have been buried next to Simonetta Vespucci.
Which begs the question, just how did Botticelli feel about Simonetta? Was he really in love with her?
What we know about Botticelli in terms of sexuality is that he never marries. When he's asked about marrying, he seems quite horrified by the idea, and he's allegedly keeping a boy. My sort of suspicion is that his interests actually lie elsewhere. If you look at culture today, there are a lot of gay artists who paint female models and who have a kind of female muse, and it's not necessarily a kind of sexualized in love with relationship. So, I mean, we could think of it, you know, in those terms, like she's a kind of Judy Garland, you know?
Whatever the truth was, and we'll never know for sure, it all adds to the mystery, only serving to increase our fascination with Botticelli and his muse, Simonetta.
It's really a beautiful gesture that when his image was resurrected in the 19th century, eventually it was decided to put a marker here that people were coming to his tomb and leaving notes for him. There are a lot of notes for him. Dear Sandro, send a little bit of inspiration to the poor Russian artist. Sandro, you deserve much more. Your art is amazing. I hope you're happy being with Simonetta Vespucci. Suggests that the myth is still very much alive, that he was inspired by her. These notes show that people are still inspired and still reading into his paintings. I mean, the birth of Venus is about the birth of beauty. I mean, that's the way that Venus was understood in the 15th century, about the birth of beauty and about the birth of love. I mean, it's a universal theme. And so, of course, today we're still interested in it.
Birth of Venus is so popular now. I've even got a little tray with the Birth of Venus on it. Tea towels, biscuit tins, jigsaw puzzles.
If I can say something personal, I first went to Florence when I was a teenager with my mum, and I couldn't sleep the night before I knew I was going to see it. I was so excited. So it does cause an almost disproportional reaction in a lot of people, and it doesn't disappoint. It's an iconic work, and it stands the test of time.
With the Birth of Venus, Botticelli laid the foundations for a modern perception of beauty and fundamentally changed the way Western art considered the female nude. His is a majestic, overpowering vision of the female triumphant. She is a goddess. Show respect.